My name is Ethan Walker, and I kept silent about this for nearly 17 years. I never told anyone because every time I tried to speak, I heard that bell again. It wasn't the kind of church bell you'd normally hear, not the kind of sound that echoes through small American towns on a Sunday morning and makes people feel at peace. The bell I heard was something dry, heavy and cold, like metal being dragged across human bone. It didn't ring through the air. It rang inside my head. I used to think time would make everything fade. That's what people always say, that horrifying memories eventually become nothing more than shadows, that nightmares lose their strength over the years, that people are capable of healing themselves. But there are some places in this world that do not let you forget. And St. Mercy Monastery, standing alone on a hillside in the northern Appalachians of Pennsylvania, was one of them. I went there in the fall of 2009 when I was 26 years old. At the time, I was working as a freelance cameraman for a group that produced short documentaries about abandoned places across the United States. Not those cheap ghost hunting cable shows. Not those fake clickbait stunts with shaky cameras and people screaming in the dark. We did real work. We researched the history, interviewed locals, documented the architecture, the legends, the fire records, the disease outbreaks, and the unexplained disappearances. There were 4 of us in the group. Mason Reed was the one leading the project, 8 years older than me, the kind of man who believed there was nothing in this world scarier than bank debt and failed contracts. Claire Donovan was our researcher, a history graduate with red hair, sharp intelligence, and a habit of writing everything down as if pen and paper could somehow keep chaos under control. Luis Ortega handled sound, the only one in the group who had grown up in a Catholic family and hated anything involving abandoned churches, cemeteries, statues of saints with their faces broken off, or Latin whispered through the wind. And me, I carried the camera and handled framing, lighting, and post-production. We got the tip about St. Mercy from an old man in Scranton. He met us in a roadside diner just before dusk, while a cold drizzle fell outside, and the entire parking lot sat under that dirty gray color. Late October always seems to bring. He wore an old wool coat and a frayed baseball cap, and when he heard Mason say we were looking for little-known abandoned religious sites, he looked up, chewed slowly on a piece of lunch meat, and asked, "You boys willing to climb Black Pine Hill?" Mason laughed. We once spent the night in an old mental hospital in Ohio. The old man shook his head. A mental hospital is something people made. I'm talking about a place people ran from. Then he told us about St. Mercy Monastery. According to him, it had once been a convent on a remote hillside, built in the late 19th century by a small religious order that took in women considered unstable, hysterical, troubled by visions, or simply girls who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock and whose wealthy families wanted them hidden away. The place operated for nearly 60 years before suddenly shutting down after a fire of unknown origin in the winter of 1958. Official records said 3 nuns died, but the locals believed the real number was much higher. What frightened people wasn't the fire. It was what had happened before it. Families on the farms below the hill said that on nights when the fog rolled in thick, they could hear bells ringing from the top of the hill, even though the chapel had been sealed for years. Some claimed they had seen figures in white habits standing in a line along the stone road that led up to the monastery. Others swore their livestock stopped eating, their dogs howled all night, and children in the area often dreamed of a woman with no eyes standing at the window, holding a blackened, burned crucifix in her hands. Louise heard all that and said we should forget it. Mason heard all that and said it sounded perfect. 3 days later, we drove into the Black Pine Hills. The road up the hill. The monastery stood nearly 20 miles from the nearest small town. From the interstate, we turned onto a narrow road that cut through maple woods and black pine. Autumn in Pennsylvania is usually beautiful, in a quiet, almost poetic way. But that stretch of road looked like an old photograph left soaking in water. Rotting leaves matted beneath the tires, a sky hanging low and leaden overhead, and the smell of wet earth and decaying wood slipping in through the cracks of the car windows. I still remember the rusted warning sign leaning crooked at the roadside. Private land, no trespassing property condemned. The sign had been shot through in several places. Claire was holding a stack of records she had printed from the county library, and she said that legally the property hadn't had a clear owner since the early 90s. There was no new fence, no security, no caretaker, just a rotting history and local rumors. At around 4 in the afternoon, we reached the base of the hill. The old stone path leading up to the monastery had been nearly swallowed by weeds. The building emerged behind a veil of thin fog, like some enormous black mass clinging to the hillside, its front facing the valley below. The architecture was a mix of Gothic and Romanesque, with gray stone walls, tall arched windows, a bell tower rising off to the left, and behind it the long residential wing of the monastery stretched out like the body of some dying animal. If you have ever seen an abandoned structure that, at first glance, made you feel as if it hated your presence, then you know exactly how I felt standing there. St. Mercy did not look like a dead building. It looked like something lying still, waiting to be disturbed. We hauled the equipment up in silence. Mason was visibly excited. Claire kept photographing the exterior and comparing it to the old maps. Luis walked with us while making the sign of the cross over and over again. I teased him about it, but the truth was, I didn't feel right either. The wind on the hillside was colder than it should have been. There were no birds, no insects, only the dry scrape of dead leaves against stone and, every now and then, a faint metallic clatter somewhere far off, as if a chain were swaying in the distance. The monastery's front door had burned halfway through long ago, and now only one leaf remained, hanging crooked on its hinges. When Mason pushed it open, the first smell that hit us was old ash mixed with mildew and something sweet enough to be rotten. "Dead animal?" Mason said. I didn't believe him. I had filmed in enough ruined places to know the smell of rats, weasels, or bats rotting in the ceiling. This was different. It smelled like something organic that had once been flesh, but had seeped into the stone, the wood, the cloth, and stayed there so long it no longer seemed to belong to any single body. The main hall was enormous with cracked marble flooring, and on the walls a few smoke-blackened reliefs of saints still remained. Directly across from the entrance stood a grand staircase that split into 2 branches leading up to the 2nd floor. Hanging above it was a wooden crucifix, burned dark at one corner, as though the fire all those years ago had licked across it and then simply stopped. Claire stood in the middle of the hall and whispered, "My God." Luis answered immediately, "Don't say his name in here." I filmed the whole space through the lens. When I watched that footage again later, I realized something had been wrong from the very beginning. The image had a faint layer of static even though the batteries were new and the camera was stable. The ambient audio carried a soft hiss underneath it, almost like someone breathing into the microphone from very far away. But at the time, we didn't understand. We thought it was the damp, the dust, the thickness of the stone walls. We chose an old room in the west wing to set down our gear, lights, sleeping bags, and food. The plan was to shoot the full exterior before dark, then survey each section inside: the chapel, the nuns' sleeping quarters, the storage basement, and if we could find a way in, the bell tower too. While Mason and Claire went off to take measurements, Luis and I stayed behind to connect the audio cables. That was when the first thing happened. Luis was plugging in the recorder when he suddenly froze. "I hear someone singing," he said. I stopped what I was doing. "Singing what?" "I don't know. Sounds like a hymn." I listened. At first there was nothing except the wind moving through the hallways. But then, very faintly, there really was a sound. Not a clear voice singing words. Just a string of low, mournful notes drifting in and out, as if they were coming from somewhere deep inside the building or from beneath the stone floor itself. "Probably wine blowing through a vent," I said. Luis looked at me. "This place burned in 1958. What kind of vent would still be working?" I didn't answer. Around 5:30, the daylight outside began to die for good. Fog from the woods below the valley slowly crept up the hillside, sliding across the stone steps and slipping through the empty window frames like cold white smoke. The monastery began to change after dark. In daylight, it had only been frightening in the way ruined architecture can be frightening. But at night, it became something else. Something deliberate. The chapel and the journal. The chapel sat at the center of the building just beyond the main hall. It had a high, pointed, vaulted ceiling, 2 rows of pews burned halfway through, and a marble altar cracked straight down the middle. Behind the altar were 3 stained glass windows, nearly all of them shattered, with only a few fragments of red and dark blue still catching the flashlight beam. The moment I stepped inside, I felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. The silence in the chapel was so complete that the sound of our shoes crunching through ash felt almost disrespectful. Claire found a fallen wooden cabinet along one side wall. Inside were a few prayer books with their edges burned black, and a leather-bound notebook, mildew-stained but still partly readable. She lifted it like she had just found gold. "A journal," she said. Mason smiled. "Perfect. That's material for the documentary." We sat down on the nearest pew to look through it. Most of the writing inside had been smeared beyond recognition, but some of the last pages were still legible. The handwriting was small, rigid, and neatly slanted, exactly the kind of script you would expect from an old-fashioned nun. There was no full name, only initials. SM. Claire read aloud in the flashlight beam. November 12th. Mother Superior ordered the south room locked after evening prayers. Sister Agnes says she heard knocking beneath the floor again. We are not permitted to speak of it. Another page read, November 17th. The new girl was brought in during the night. They say she suffers from religious hysteria, but when I looked into her eyes, I did not see madness. I saw something looking back through her. Luis muttered a curse under his breath. Claire turned a few more pages, her lips pressed tight. November 22nd. There is a smell of smoke in the east corridor, though the furnace has not been lit. The chapel bell rang on its own at 2:13 in the morning. Mother Superior says it is a trial of faith. I am no longer certain God is still in this place. I remember very clearly how my hands turned cold, even through my gloves. Then Claire read the passage that made all four of us go completely silent. December 1st. Mother Superior has ordered that no one is to look toward the staircase when the night bell rings. I asked why. She said, because the one standing there will know you saw it. Mason looked up, trying to sound calm. Sounds like the nuns were telling ghost stories to scare each other. Claire didn't answer. She turned to the last page that could still be read clearly. The handwriting there was noticeably shakier, with the ink pressed hard into the paper in places, as if the writer had been panicking. December 7th. We have been forbidden to go down into the basement. They say the women there must be cleansed, but the crying is not the sound of prayer. Last night I saw Sister Beatrice standing in the hallway, though she died last week in the boiler room. Her eyes. At that point, the sentence dissolved into a long black smear of ink. The last readable line said, "If anyone finds this journal, do not let the bell ring a third time." The instant Claire finished reading that sentence, a bell rang somewhere deep inside the building. Just once. Heavy, low, almost unreal. None of us moved for several seconds. Its echo crawled along the vaulted ceiling, rolled through the burned pews, and slowly faded into the darkness behind the altar. Luis was the first one to jump to his feet. "I'm getting out of here." Mason had gone pale too, but his stubborn streak made him say, "There's probably still some cable hanging in the bell tower. The wind must have shifted it." "There is no wind in the chapel," Claire said. I lifted the camera and started filming out of pure reflex. We should check. Looking back now, that was the first stupid decision in a long chain of stupid decisions. We left the chapel and went back into the main hall. And there, right in the middle of the grand staircase, in the thick dust covering the stone floor, was a line of wet footprints. Not shoe prints, not boot prints. Bare footprints, small and narrow, like the feet of a woman or a teenage girl. They started from the dark hallway to the left, crossed the hall, and stopped at the very first step of the staircase. We froze. "Did someone come in here before us?" Mason asked, but his voice had gone rough and thin. I dropped to one knee and aimed my flashlight at the floor. The footprints were fresh. Liquid had pooled in the shallow grooves pressed into the dust. Claire whispered, "That's not water. Look at the color." In the beam of the flashlight, the liquid looked a shade darker than water. Not bright red like blood, just a thin brownish stain, like dirty runoff seeping from rotted cloth. Luis took a step back. "I'm serious. We need to leave right now." No one had time to answer. The second bell rang. This time it was closer, longer, and when it sounded, I could swear the whole building gave a faint shudder, as if it were breathing in. I remembered the line from the journal. "Do not look toward the staircase when the night bell rings." And of course, like any fool driven by fear, I looked. Standing on the landing between the two flights of stairs, in the darkness just beneath the blackened crucifix, was a woman. She wore a white-gray habit, dusty and hanging down to her ankles. Her arms rested at her sides, her head tilted slightly to one side, like someone with a broken neck. In that first second, I couldn't make out her face clearly. All I could see was skin that looked far too pale against the darkness around her. Then she lifted her head. I don't know how to describe it in a way that feels accurate enough. She had no eyes, not empty black sockets like in the movies, not anything bloody or grotesque. Where her eyes should have been, there were only two smooth planes of scarred or burned skin, unnaturally flat, as if the face had never been fully made. Below that was a pale mouth, closed at first, stretched slightly wider than it should have been. I heard Louise scream behind me. Claire dropped the journal. Mason swore out loud. But the thing on the landing did not rush at us. It only stood there. And even without eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that it was staring straight at me. Then its head tilted farther, slowly enough to be agonizing, and its mouth opened as if it were about to say something. Every one of our flashlights went out at the same time. The darkness in the East Hall. I had never been afraid of the dark until that night. People usually think the frightening part is what you see in the dark. But there are kinds of darkness that are more active than that. They do not just hide things. They force you to imagine the worst, and then make you pray that imagination is all it is. Luis slammed his flashlight against his palm, cursing in Spanish. Claire was breathing hard somewhere close beside me. Mason shouted for everyone to stay where they were. Then the small red emergency light hanging from our gear bag suddenly flickered on at the far end of the hall. It was dim, barely enough to reveal the drifting columns of dust and the faint outline of the staircase. The landing between the stairs was empty. The woman was gone. "No one goes anywhere alone," Mason said, but his voice was cracking. "We grab the gear and get off this hill." "Now?" Claire asked. "Yes, now." It sounded simple enough, but from the moment we decided to leave to the moment we realized we might not be able to, less than 10 minutes passed. We went back to the room in the west wing where we had stashed our equipment. Part of it had been knocked onto the floor. One tripod had fallen across the battery bag. The cable case was wide open. I swear to God, we had left everything organized. There was no wind strong enough to do that. No animal could have gotten in there. Luis picked up the recorder and said, "You all need to hear this." He played back the audio from the chapel. At first, it was only our footsteps, the rustle of paper, Claire reading from the journal. But underneath it all, from the very beginning, there was another layer of sound, very faint. When Luis turned up the volume, I felt every hair on my arm stand up. It was the sound of many women whispering at once, their voices overlapping, the language impossible to make out. And just before the first bell rang, another voice rose above all the others. It spoke in English, quiet but perfectly clear. "Don't let her come down." No one said a word. Mason shut the recorder off immediately. "That's enough. Back to the truck." We gathered the equipment and headed into the main hall. And that was when we saw the front door. It was closed, not partly shut, fully slammed closed. The heavy wooden door that had been hanging crooked on its hinges now sat pressed tight into the frame, as if the hinges had never been broken at all. Mason rushed forward and pulled on it. It didn't move. I grabbed the other side and threw my shoulder against it. Nothing. A half-burned door like that should never have felt so heavy. But it stood there like a wall. Luis started stumbling through the Hail Mary. Claire looked around the hall, her face drained of color. There has to be another way out, through the kitchen or the laundry wing. So we were forced to go deeper into the monastery to find an exit. The east corridor was where Claire said the nuns had once lived. The ceiling was lower there, the walls covered in rotting floral wallpaper, and a row of small doors on either side opened into narrow sleeping rooms like something out of an old boarding school. Every time we passed one of those doorways, I had the feeling someone was standing just inside, pressed flat against the wall, waiting for the flashlight beam to move on. The temperature in the east wing was unnaturally cold. Our breath came out in thin white clouds. In the third room on the right, Claire found a scorched photograph hanging crooked on the wall. It showed maybe a dozen nuns standing on the chapel steps, probably taken sometime in the 1930s or 1940s. None of them were smiling. Their faces were stiff and severe, the way people often looked in old photographs. Luis aimed his flashlight at the center of the picture and swore. I looked closer. One of the nuns standing in the back row had a damaged face, not from fire. The paper where her eyes should have been had been torn or worn away into two pale blank spots, making it look as though she had no eyes at all. Claire quickly set the photograph back down. "Don't touch it again," she said. About 30 feet farther down the corridor, we started hearing a scratching sound. It was coming from behind the wall on the left. Not fast, not frantic, slow, steady, like human fingernails dragging across wood from one end to the other. All four of us went completely still. Mason lowered his voice. "Rats." The scratching stopped. Then 3 knocks came from inside the wall. Knock, knock, knock. Luis backed up so fast he ran into me. "There's someone in the wall." "That's impossible," I said, though by then I hardly believed my own words. The knocking moved. From the wall on the left, it shifted to a point directly ahead of us, behind the last door at the end of the corridor. Claire checked the floor plan in her file. "The old infirmary." Mason stepped forward. "What if it's a homeless person?" I didn't understand how he was still clinging to that explanation. Maybe because people would rather believe in a drifter living inside the walls than accept something worse. He turned the doorknob. The door wasn't locked. Inside was a wrecked old examination room with 2 rusted iron beds, an overturned medicine cabinet, and windows boarded shut. On the far wall, beneath peeling whitewash and mildew stains, someone had written in a smeared dark brown substance, "She is not a nun." Claire jerked back from the doorway. "Let's go." But by then, Luis had lifted the recorder, sweeping it around the room as if he wanted to catch more sound. He turned toward the left side, where a smaller door led into an inner room. That door was closed, and from behind it, we heard someone breathing. Not the sound of someone tired, not crying. It was a deep, deliberate inhale, held for far too long, followed by an exhale that came out as a rough, broken rasp, like air passing through a throat burned raw. Mason raised a hand for silence. We listened again. The sound was right behind that door. I still do not understand why I stayed where I was instead of running. Maybe fear sometimes traps the body between the instinct to survive and the need to know what is about to kill you. Then the little door slowly began to open on its own. Just a crack. And in that narrow strip of darkness, a finger appeared. It was too long, with gray skin and a blackened nail that looked burned. It curled around the edge of the door from the inside and pulled it open just a little more. Luis screamed and hurled the recorder straight at it. The impact cracked like a gunshot, and that was enough to snap all of us out of it. Mason bolted first. The rest of us ran after him, charging out of the east corridor without caring any more about the equipment or the documentary or anything else. As we passed through the main hall, I made the mistake of looking up once. The eyeless woman was standing on the staircase landing again, but this time she was not alone. On either side of her were other white shapes, shorter, dimmer, like nuns half burned away inside a curtain of smoke. And I heard them clearly, even though I never saw their mouths move. "Don't let her come down." The basement. The way down to the basement was behind the old kitchen, just as Claire had guessed. The heavy steel door leading downstairs had been warped by heat, but it still opened. None of us wanted to go down there. We just didn't have a choice anymore. The outside exit in the kitchen was jammed shut, and the windows had been boarded over from the outside. Mason said the basement might connect to a coal room or an old service passage leading out to the backside of the hill. "And if it doesn't?" Luis asked. Mason didn't answer. The staircase going down was dark and narrow, with stone walls sweating moisture. The smell down there was completely different from upstairs. Cold, moldy, and metallic, like rust soaked in water for too long. With every step, I felt the pressure in my ears building, the way it does when you go deep underground. By then, our flashlights were working normally again, which somehow made everything worse, because it forced us to see clearly. The basement of St. Mercy did not look like a simple storage area. It was divided into multiple small chambers, some with iron bars, others more like treatment rooms, with old leather restraints still strapped to the bed frames. Room numbers and a few faded Latin phrases still clung to the walls. Claire read one crooked metal sign in a trembling voice. "Ward of Restoration." "Restoration for what?" Luis said. We passed one chamber with a large steel water tank and old pipes hanging overhead. That was probably the boiler room or steam room the journal had mentioned. Somewhere inside me, I began to understand that this monastery had not been just a place of prayer. It had been a prison for women society wanted buried alive and kept out of sight. In the fourth chamber, we found the clearest evidence yet. On the concrete floor, beneath the dust, were dense scratch marks, as if someone had spent years clawing at it with their fingernails. And on the wall, at about the height of a seated person's head, there were countless tally marks carved in rows, keeping track of the days. Claire raised a hand to cover her mouth. "My God," Luis whispered. "They kept people down here." Mason was no longer pretending to be rational. Sweat was running down his neck even though the air was freezing. "Find a way out, now." At the very end of the basement hall was a large circular room with a low ceiling. In the center stood a stone well sealed with a heavy iron cover. Around the cover, the floor had been blackened in a ring, as if fires had been lit there over and over again. On the far wall hung an upside-down crucifix, half burned away, but crooked, as if someone had tried to turn it back upright and given up halfway through. Claire shined her light on the documents and said very softly, "This room isn't on the floor plan." Right then, a knocking sound came from deep beneath the iron cover. Not loud, just 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Luis actually started crying, not loudly. Tears were just running down his face while he stood there frozen. Mason yelled, "Who's down there?" That was the second mistake. The moment the words left his mouth, the entire room seemed to shake with the sound of a third bell. This time, there was no doubt. It was not coming from the bell tower. It was coming from directly beneath our feet, as if some enormous bell had been buried deep in the earth. The iron well cover shifted slightly. I will never forget that sound. Metal scraping against stone, slow, heavy, absolutely impossible, unless something with tremendous force was pushing from below. Mason stumbled backward. Claire dropped to her knees. Luis started reciting prayers in a frantic rush. The cover slid far enough to reveal a narrow black gap, and from that opening came a rush of burned smoke, rotting flesh, and a blast of heat that had no business being there. Something was climbing up from below. I aimed my flashlight down on instinct. The beam only reached a few spiral stone steps, descending into solid blackness. Then, far below, very far below, two gray hands gripped one of the steps. They were not the hands of a corpse, not bones. They were the hands of a woman, but the skin was split like burned charcoal, the fingertips blackened, the joints unnaturally long, and lower still, something lifted its face out of the dark. I never got a full look at it. I only saw patches of pale gray skin, part of a scorched veil, and a mouth opened far too wide without making a sound. But I knew immediately it was not one of the white figures from the staircase. This was the thing those others were afraid of, the thing they had been whispering about all along. Don't let her come down. Claire screamed, "Close it! Close it!" All four of us threw ourselves at the cover and dragged it back. It was impossibly heavy, but panic gave us strength. I could feel the iron edges cutting into my hands, hear Luis shouting prayers, hear Mason roaring like an animal being cornered. Just before the cover slammed back into place, a woman's voice rose from the gap below, rough and shredded, like hot coals scraping through a throat. "Ethan." I froze. It said my name. No one in the group had spoken my name down there in the basement. That split second nearly cost us the cover, but then Mason shoved with everything he had. It slammed shut with a deafening metallic crash. A second later, whatever was down there struck the underside of it once, hard enough to make the whole floor jump. Claire looked around wildly. In one corner of the room, there was an old heavy chain bolted to a wall hook. We dragged it over, wrapped it through the handle on the well cover, and pulled it tight. A rusted old padlock was still hanging there, and somehow it fit perfectly when we snapped it shut. The moment the lock clicked into place, the room went completely silent. So silent my ears started ringing. Then, from the basement corridors around us, the whispering began. Many women's voices, very soft, very close, as if they were standing just beyond the edge of our flashlight beams. I could not make out words, only fear. Given sound, Louis kept shaking his head. "We can't stay here. We can't stay here." Claire stared at the blackened ring around the well. They were keeping something trapped down there. "No," I said, and I still remember the cold certainty I felt in that moment. They were worshiping it. Then later, they tried to trap it. The fire of 1958. We left the well room through another corridor that led to the records storage area. That was where Claire found the last documents explaining why St. Mercy had been erased from local memory so quickly. The archive room was heavy with damp. Its shelves collapsed into each other. Most of the documents had rotted away, but inside a tin box, a few files had survived with only their edges burned. We sat down on the freezing floor and read them by the shaking beams of our flashlights. There were letters from the diocese referring to unauthorized ritual practices. There were medical reports on female patients displaying delirium, glossolalia, and self-inflicted injury. There was an internal investigation report from 1957 naming Mother Beatrice Hale, the monastery's superior, who had been accused of conducting secret purification rites on women believed to bear signs of demonic influence. But the last document was the one that nearly slipped from Claire's hands. It was an unsent handwritten letter signed Sister Margaret, almost certainly the same SM from the journal. Parts of it were fragmented, but the meaning was clear enough. Mother Beatrice had become convinced that one of the women brought to the monastery wasn't entirely human. The girl's name was Evelyn Cross, 19 years old, sent there by her family after she claimed to keep seeing a woman standing in fire at the foot of my bed. During her time at St. Mercy, Evelyn suffered violent seizures, spoke of a mother beneath the hill, and repeatedly insisted that someone was calling each nun by name in the night. Beatrice never turned Evelyn over to a doctor. She believed the girl was a doorway for some evil presence, or worse, a sacred vessel that needed to be opened. The rituals began as prayer, fasting, and confinement in the basement, then gradually became torture disguised as purification. Sister Margaret wrote that 3 nuns had died during the process. One hanged herself in her room. One was locked inside the steam chamber. And another, Agnes, had her eyes gouged out after trying to stop Beatrice from continuing the ritual. I stopped at that line. Agnes, the eyeless woman on the staircase. The document went on to say that on a night in December 1958, Beatrice ordered the bell rung 3 times to begin the opening rite. But a group of nuns, still in their right minds, fought back. They tried to burn the basement to keep whatever was down there from rising. The fire spread too fast. The monastery burned all night. When firefighters arrived from the town below the hill, they never found Beatrice's body. The official record listed her as missing. Sister Margaret ended the letter with a sentence that was nearly impossible to read through the smeared ink, but I was still able to piece it together. If the fire is not enough, then may God keep the bell silent, for when it rings the 3rd time, Mother Beatrice will find her way up from beneath the hill once more. No one spoke for almost a full minute. Then, from very close by, right outside the archive room door, we heard the sound of fabric dragging across stone. We switched off our flashlights on instinct. In the darkness, the sound stopped directly outside the door. I could hear dry breathing, and the smell of old smoke began slipping in through the crack beneath it. A hand rested against the wooden door from the outside. It was not my imagination. I could see the shadow of the knuckles in the faint line of light under the frame. The door began to open. Mason lunged forward and shoved against it. Luis and I joined him. Claire was almost paralyzed, clutching the box of documents to her chest like the last charm left in the world. Whatever was on the other side did not pound or scratch. It only pushed back with a slow, horrifying patience, as if it knew sooner or later we would tire. Then, through the narrow seam between the door and the frame, a woman's rasping voice said, "You heard the bell." The pressure suddenly increased. The door gave another inch. Through the gap, I saw a section of pale gray flesh, burned and blistered, and a mouth that was smiling. Luis screamed the name of God. Mason drove his boot into the bottom of the door. In blind desperation, I reached across the floor for anything at all, and my hand closed around an old church candle and my Zippo lighter. The idea came to me almost without thinking. I flicked the lighter open and set fire to a pile of rotted paper and dry rags beside the fallen shelf. The flames caught fast. Whatever was outside the door let out a shriek, a high, piercing sound, half human and half metal, screaming from heat. The pressure vanished at once. We stumbled back from the door just as the fire spread to the rotted drapes and paper boxes. "Are you insane?" Mason shouted. "Fire stopped her once," I shouted back, "and it's going to kill us too." He was right. Within seconds, the archive room had turned into a furnace. Black smoke rolled up the ceiling. We had no choice but to run back into the corridor before we suffocated. But the shrieking outside had stopped, and for the first time since entering St. Mercy, I realized that thing was afraid of something more than we were. Fire. The night we ran, The building came alive in the most horrifying way once the fire started. Smoke streamed through the hallways. Bells rang out in scattered bursts, near and far, like metal striking metal in different rooms all at once. The women's whispers were clearer now, faster, almost urgent. "Go. Upstairs. Hurry." We ran up a side staircase to the first floor and back toward the main hall, planning to break through the front door again in the chaos. But when we got there, the fire below had already sent smoke rising through the cracks in the floor. And the main staircase. I do not want to remember it, but I have to tell it. Every step of the grand staircase was lined with the figures of nuns in faded habits, dim as smoke, but clear enough to see their faces warped by fire, by pain, by terror. They were not blocking us. They stood facing down into the hall as if they were standing guard. And on the highest landing, beneath the burned crucifix, Mother Beatrice was there. I knew it was her, even though I had never seen a clear photograph of her. She was unnaturally tall, or maybe it was only the long robe dragging across the steps that made her shape seem stretched and wrong. The edges of her black veil were burned through, and the exposed skin of her face was pale gray, like wet paper. One cheek was cracked like porcelain overheated in a kiln. Her eyes. God, her eyes were nothing like the eyes of the living. They were deep and dark like coals buried in ash, but inside them there was a dull red glow, like embers that had never gone out. She looked straight at me. Not Mason, not Claire, not Louise, me. And then she spoke, her voice at once rasping and soft, like a mother singing to a child. "You opened the door." And I shook my head and backed away. "No." She stepped down one stair. The ghostly nuns on either side of her began to tremble. "The bell called," she said. "You heard your name? That means you belong to this place." Luis tore the little wooden crucifix from around his neck and threw it at her. It passed through the air in front of her chest as if he had thrown it into smoke. But the entire hall instantly shook with a hideous wail from somewhere behind the staircase. Claire grabbed my arm. "The chapel! The broken window! We can get out that way!" We turned and ran. Mother Beatrice did not chase us the way a person would. She only walked slowly, but no matter which hallway we ran into, the sound of dragging fabric and the smell of smoke appeared behind us as if distance meant nothing to her. By then, the chapel was full of gray smoke and the flicker of fire spilling through the arches. The remaining fragments of stained glass reflected red, like blood. We grabbed one of the half-burned pews and slammed it against the large window behind the altar. On the third hit, the rest of the glass shattered. The opening was just wide enough to crawl through. Mason shoved Claire out first. She went through, slicing her hands on the jagged edges. Louise followed. I turned back to help Mason, and that was when I saw Mother Beatrice standing at the head of the center aisle. She was no longer far away, no more than 30 feet from us. The half-burned nuns had appeared along both sides of the pews like a silent congregation. She raised one hand toward me. "Ethan." The way she said my name did not sound like a threat. It sounded like recognition, like a reminder that from the moment I first stepped inside the monastery, I had already been marked. I backed toward the shattered window, but my foot caught on something on the floor. I looked down and saw Sister Margaret's journal, somehow lying right at my feet, even though Claire had put it in her bag. Wind, coincidence, or something else. The journal was open to the last page. There was a line there we had not noticed before, written faintly beneath the smeared ink. "If she rises, return her to the fire before the altar." I looked up, and in front of the altar were still 2 large brass candle stands, and one of them was wrapped in rotting altar cloth. Without thinking, I grabbed the candle, flicked open my Zippo, and set the cloth on fire. The flames caught at once, and the instant the fire flared up, every ghostly nun in the chapel turned their heads toward Mother Beatrice. For the first time, I saw fear in her. Not much, just the slightest tightening at the corner of her mouth and throat. But enough. The white figures began moving toward her. Not quickly, not violently, just a procession of the dead stepping forward out of decades of pain, finally finding the courage to hold back the one who had dragged them into hell. Mother Beatrice let out a shriek that did not belong in any human throat. She stepped back once, then again, into the hand she had reached toward me, curled into a claw. The ghostly nuns seized her robe, her wrists, her shoulders, and among them I saw the eyeless woman, Agnes, standing closest of all, her smooth, empty sockets lifted toward the superior's face. Beatrice screamed, "You swore obedience to me." And another voice, whether from one of them or from all of them together, I do not know, rose through the crackle of flames and the sound of shattering glass. "Not anymore." Mason grabbed my shoulder and yanked hard. "Jump!" I climbed through the broken window and fell hard onto the wet, grassy slope behind the monastery. Claire and Louise were already down there, covered in mud and blood from the glass. We had barely managed to scramble to our feet when a deep crashing sound came from inside the chapel, like part of the wooden roof giving way. The fire spread up into the ceiling and licked across the bell tower. The bell began ringing wildly, but unlike before, it no longer sounded like a summons. It sounded like something being jerked and slammed in desperation. We ran down the hillside through the darkness, slipping on dead leaves and wet stone. None of us dared look back for more than a second. Only when we were nearly at the tree line did I turn around once. St. Mercy Monastery was burning red at the top of the hill like an enormous candle set in the fog. In one of the upper windows, lit by the flames, I saw the shape of a tall figure, standing perfectly still. Maybe it was a wooden beam. Maybe it was a curtain burning. But I know who I saw. And beside that figure, in the other glowing windows, were white shapes standing motionless, looking down into the valley until the roof collapsed and all of them vanished into the smoke. What remained after the fire? We reached the car close to midnight. Mason drove like a madman down to the nearest town. No one said a word the whole way, except for Louise choking back sobs and Claire trembling uncontrollably in the back seat. When we finally found the local police, we told them the monastery had caught fire because of our equipment during the survey. We did not mention the bell. We did not mention the well. We did not mention Mother Beatrice. We only said that we had been trapped inside and were lucky to make it out alive. The next morning, the fire department made it up to the site. Most of St. Mercy had collapsed. No bodies were found, except for a few old bone fragments in the basement, and the investigation later concluded that the fire had started when dry materials ignited from an unidentified heat source. We were heavily fined, lost the entire project, and Mason was nearly ruined by insurance lawsuits. The group fell apart soon after. Louis went back to Texas and quit sound work for good. I heard he spent some time at a retreat monastery, then got married and had 2 children, but he never answered another message from me. Claire sent me one envelope 3 months after it happened. Inside was a copy of the St. Mercy records and a handwritten note. Never go back. They held her one more time, but I'm not sure it's forever. 3 years later, Claire died in a car accident in Boston. Mason is still alive, or at least he was for a while, but he drank himself into ruin. The last time I saw him was in 2018 in Pittsburgh. We sat in a bar near the train station, both of us avoiding any mention of St. Mercy until he was drunk enough to tell the truth. He leaned across the table, his eyes bloodshot, and asked me, "Do you still hear the bell?" I did not answer. He laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has not slept in far too long. "I hear it every night, at 2:13, 3 tolls, always 3 tolls." 2 months later, Mason killed himself in his apartment. The police listed it as depression. There was a message on his bedroom wall, written in blood or red paint. The press never released it, but I know what it said because his sister called me in a panic. It said, "She is coming down. She is coming down." Why I'm telling this story? I'm telling it now because last week I received a package with no return address. Inside were only 2 things. The first was a scorched piece of stained glass, dark red in color, clearly taken from a window in St. Mercy's chapel. The second was an old yellowed sheet of paper, folded into quarters. The handwriting on it was Claire's. I do not know when she wrote it or why it only reached me now. The message was very short. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means that place is not dead. I was wrong to think fire would be enough. Some places are not destroyed. They are only silenced for a while. If the bell starts ringing again, do not answer anyone who calls your name. And if you see a nun standing at the top of the stairs, do not look up." Last night at 2:13 a.m., when the church bell in the town where I live did not ring at all, but I still heard it. 3 tolls, as clear as it was in 2009. From my bedroom window, I looked out at the slope leading up to the main road. There was a low layer of fog, even though this is not the season for it. And in that fog, beneath a pale yellow streetlight, there was a figure standing perfectly still. A long robe, a covered head, both arms hanging at its sides, its face tilted up toward my apartment. I did not look for long. I learned that lesson at the cost of friends, fire, and 17 years of nightmares. If anyone asks me whether this story is true, I will not argue. I do not need anyone to believe me. I only need to tell it as it happened, or as close to the truth as I can manage when a survivor's memory has been gnawed away by fear. Maybe St. Mercy was only a place so full of violence, fanaticism, and sin that anyone who entered it eventually lost their mind beneath its weight. Maybe Mother Beatrice was only a sick historical figure, and what we saw that night was mass panic in the middle of smoke, darkness, and rotting architecture. I tried to believe that once. But reason does not explain how a well-sealed shut since 1958 could still have something beneath it calling my name. Reason does not explain audio recordings that captured the voices of the dead. Reason does not explain why, everywhere I have moved, every few years, someone reports that a nearby church bell starts ringing on its own at 2:13 in the morning. I have lived long enough to understand one thing. There are places that are not haunted in the usual sense. Not because spirits linger out of longing, not because the dead cannot move on, but because in that place a door was once opened. St. Mercy Monastery on the Hillside was never just an abandoned building. It was a scar, a mouth hastily sewn shut with fire and prayer. And the dead who remained there, Agnes, Margaret, the women locked in the basement, the nuns who burned in that December night, were not necessarily trying to harm the living. Maybe all those years, they were doing only one thing: keeping whatever was beneath the hill from coming out. If one day you find yourself driving through the northern hills of Pennsylvania, And some worn-out local in a roadside diner tells you not to head toward Black Pine after sunset. Listen to him. If you see an old stone road disappearing up a fog-covered slope, do not let curiosity win. If you hear a bell from high above, slow, heavy, dry, like metal scraping against bone, do not count the tolls. And if in some dark hallway of a place you should never have entered, you hear a woman's hoarse voice call you by name, do not answer. Because once she knows you can hear her, she will know the way down. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you can follow the next horror stories from the mysterious world. Thank you.